and we end the interview with this. What percentage are you giving 1776? Sara answers, I'm giving 75%. 1776. Oh my god, hey! Welcome back to my Stagey YouTube channel. If you are seeing my face for the first time, hello! My name is Mickey Joe and I am obsessed with all things theatre. I am an independent theatre critic and pundit and content creator based here in the UK. And this is my Stagey YouTube channel where I make videos about the shows that I've been to see here in the UK, and I review stuff and I talk about news and gossip and drama happening in the theatre community worldwide. And today's video takes us across the Atlantic over to Broadway, where there's a little bit of controversy brewing on social media in response to an interview with one of the stars of Broadway's new revival of 1776. Now, if you're not new to this channel, you will know this is not my usual YouTube setup. I am away for the weekend, staying with my boyfriend's family, but I have been seeing Twitter get more and more worked up about this particular interview. And I think it's a really interesting thing to talk about because we are seeing division here within the Broadway community. You know, often when something controversial happens, people usually align themselves to one particular side of it. We are anti a certain figure in the Broadway community if they have been outed as this terrible person, or we are pro this cast ought to have been treated in a different way. It's not as often that we see something that proves to be completely divisive and really splits people. And I think what's splitting people here is a few things. I think some of this is racially motivated. I think there is a generational divide here in terms of people's attitudes towards work and capitalism. We're going to get to all of that. But certainly we're going to be talking about Broadway and performing and, you know, commercial musical theatre in this video in a way that doesn't often get talked about. This is maybe the darker, more realistic side of showbiz that this has brought to light. So I couldn't resist talking about it, and we're going to get into it today. This is probably going to be a long video because this is a conversation that requires a decent amount of nuance, so stay with me. Before I begin, if you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to subscribe to my Stagey YouTube channel. Sometimes I talk about more fun, silly stuff. Sometimes I post videos of what I get up to in the week. Mostly I post a lot of reviews and reactions to news. If all of that sounds like some stuff that you might be interested in, make sure you have subscribed. And if you really enjoyed today's video, feel free to use the super thanks button down below, somewhere along here, to give me a tip. That would really help me as a Stagey content creator. Now let's talk about Sara Porkalob and 1776. So to give you a little bit of context, 1776 is a Broadway musical about the Founding Fathers and about the Declaration of Independence. And since the dawn of Hamilton on Broadway, 1776 has kind of been pushed to the background as the less up-to-date, less modern, less topical version of this story. Hamilton's racially diverse approach to casting and the uplifting of the voices of women during this time really showed 1776 up for being a very white male-centered version of this story, which in all fairness, it's a very white male-centered narrative. You're talking about the Founding Fathers of the United States. But what the 2022 revival of 1776 on Broadway has attempted to do is take on a similar reconfiguration of casting. We have a cast that heavily involves women and is very trans-inclusive as well as being racially diverse. Does this feel like it's in response to the success of Hamilton? Absolutely, but also probably the only way that 1776 was ever going to legitimately make it back to Broadway. Now, one of the emerging stars of this revival, apparently, is Sara Porkalob, who plays Edward Rutledge. Now, Sara has recently done an interview with Vulture.com, which is sending shockwaves through the theatre community. As well as being a performer, Sara is a theatre maker and has a great many thoughts about this revival and about how it was devised and about their own role in it and their performance and their approach to their performance. I want to read you through a lot of the article because I think it's important that we hear Sara's voice in all this and we hear exactly what was said. So much of this is being reported without context, and I think the responsible thing to do in terms of reporting on this is to document exactly what was said. So to give you a little bit more context as to Sara's role in this revival, it tells us here Sara plays Edward Rutledge, the pro-slavery South Carolina representative and the youngest signatory of the Declaration of Independence. 20 minutes before the show ends, Rutledge performs Molasses to Rum, a song decrying a potential anti-slavery clause in the Declaration of Independence, calling out the hypocrisy of John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and the rest of the North who advocated for the anti-slavery clause while drinking rum made via slave labor. profiting off of slave ships and raping enslaved women, who end up having children also put on the block. By the time the song is over, the audience is left with two things: a distaste for America's founding fathers and the knowledge that they've just witnessed a star being born. The star is Sara Porkalob, previously best known for her Dragon Cycle trilogy of solo-performed musicals exploring her family history. It then goes on to talk about the casting approach for this revival, the fact that it has cast women and non-binary people of various races to play the founding fathers, with the goal of reminding audiences of the faces that were not considered during the Declaration of Independence's writing. This revival of the show is being directed by Diane Paulus, who you will know as the director of the sort of circusy revival of Pippin, the director of Waitress, of Jagged Little Pill, of the big bold revival of Hair that was on Broadway in around 2009. She's associated with a lot of bold revivals of musical theatre. And co-director of this is Jeffrey L. Page, who is credited as having been the choreographer of Violet when it was on Broadway in 2014. So key to all of this is the acknowledgement in this article that Porkalob is a multi-hyphenate performer, which means that they've worked as a director, as a writer, as well as a performer. And so they have a decent amount of creative insight into the process. So straight off the bat, you can imagine that just performing in something and having a limited creative involvement where you are not in the director's chair, where you are not involved in a devising process in the way that you might be used to, has to be alienating and unusual and inevitably probably very frustrating. Sarah says, "To me, the play is a relic. I admire Jeffrey and Diane for taking this on as directors. I wouldn't have." Which is a bold opening statement. So the interviewer for Vulture.com was Jason P. Frank, who asks, first of all, would you describe 1776's casting as colourblind? Sara Porkalob replied that the casting was a colour-conscious puzzle. I think it was a very deliberate choice from the creative team to cast our John Adams as a black woman, but nobody sat down on the creative team and said, we're going to look at everybody's intersectional identity and think how it explicitly interacts with this character who has 10 lines. They said, we want to have a diverse cast, we definitely want enough black folks, we want some people who are non-black POC folks, and we've got to have some white folks. Sara Porkalob also acknowledges, I also think that they cast the best people for the roles. So there's an interesting duality in that statement, where we're acknowledging great best people cast in these roles, but also straight off the bat saying the intersectionality of identity wasn't really considered. And I think we see this a lot with colourblind casting. There was a lot of dialogue when Hamilton's first cast were leaving the show and when replacements were coming in and when other productions were opening about the casting of Angelica Schuyler as a woman of colour who wasn't necessarily a black woman. I saw a lot of people saying online that it is a black woman's responsibility and unique opportunity to play Angelica Schuyler because she was a slaver, because she was a slave owner. And so in terms of redeeming the specificities of that character's historical challenges, that blackness is something very important in the casting process, which is interesting. I don't know that I have my own perspective on that, but I definitely think there is a difference between casting that consciously subverts a historical character's identity for a particular reason and casting that just looks different to how it is expected to. Is this meaningful racially altered casting, or is this just the appearance of non-white and diverse as a label? Because I think the latter of those things is sometimes what we default to, especially when the producers and the creative team are predominantly white, which I will say is not the case here. Sarah is asked, what do you think is the effect of that casting? And answers, the casting is providing resources. The resources include a weekly salary, but also exposure for actors who traditionally would not be cast in this show. It's showing audiences all of these faces that wouldn't typically be seen, and it's also inviting audiences to consider how the country was founded without the consideration of people like that particular cast in mind. Those are three things I think it's doing successfully. After that, it gets a little complicated. A lot complicated, I should say. And Sarah goes on to say, 1776 was written in the 1960s by two dudes. It won the Best Musical Tony over Hair, which has also been directed famously by Diane Paulus in the last few decades. When it was written during the Vietnam War, there was a generation of people who had bought into the American dream, and part of the American dream was fighting for democracy. Then there was this generation after them that thought maybe we're sending our young men off to die for no reason, Vietnam being a very important cultural landmark for the US. So it's funny to look at 1776 and Hair as two very different musicals written at the same time but in response to the same thing. 1776 has this desire to humanize the Founding Fathers and feels like a callback to nostalgic America. And this is where Sara says, "To me, the play is a relic, it is a dusty old thing." When asked specifically about the song Molasses to Rum and pointing out that it critiques Northern complicity, which is something that we still don't hear a lot, Sara answers, "Act 2 has 2 numbers in it that remind me why we're doing this play, Mama Look Sharp and Molasses to Rum." And Sara then shares that the directors have said the reason they're doing this play is because of the song Molasses to Rum. That song packs not only the political punch that it's always had, but today rings truer, probably the most true of all the numbers. Jason asks, then there is The Egg, which presents all these great moments of American history that happened after the events of the show by projecting scenes from them during the song. It did throw me off given that your production seems to be critiquing American exceptionalism. What did you think of that number? Sara answers, I think the directors missed a very obvious opportunity with that song to point back at American history in the way they said they wanted to. What we see in the projection is a collage of America's history of protest, but do you know what it was sorely missing? The protests that were happening on Capitol Hill in January. Those people were literally chanting 1776. It's a choice. I would have been like, let's have this be a rock out effing song while we show those images of white supremacists charging Capitol Hill, which I'm getting chills just thinking about. I mean, that's probably, culturally in America, the most recent invocation of 1776 as a concept was with this sort of attempted overhaul of democracy and democratic process. It's an oversimplification, but you could draw a direct line in terms of moments of tremendous American division from the signing of the Declaration of Independence and this conflict between the North and South through the Vietnam War and how that really changed a lot of people's opinions and perspectives on the country through to what happened in January. So to exclude that from the narrative of a show that is meant to be topical and speaking to the current political moment does feel like a missed opportunity. I say that without having seen the show. When asked, how does it feel to be in the backseat of decision-making, Sara answered, it's horrible, I hate it. I'm privileged that Diane Paulus came to me through The Dragon Cycle, the show that Sara had written and performed. And Sara says, what I want to do with my time is make new works with collaborators. And this is where it gets a little bit controversial and deeply, deeply honest. Jason asks, so is 1776 a career move? Sara simply answers, yes. I told myself when I graduated in 2012 from undergrad that when the time came to move to New York, it would be on my own terms. The first choice would be to move here by introducing my original work. I'm living the second best choice, which is coming into New York already cast in a Broadway musical. I'm hoping that once the reviews come out and people see me perform, that I can get representation as a multi-hyphenate. I've had people reach out to rep me as an actor, but that's like 30% of what I do. Jason asks further, are you artistically fulfilled being in 1776? Sara answers, no, I'm not. The salary is good. My favourite thing the whole process is my cast. So the social aspect and the salary aspect are fulfilling, the creative aspect not so much. I feel like I'm going to work. And honestly, I don't think that that should be vilified necessarily as a perspective. I think we expect actors who get opportunities starring on Broadway, specifically in Broadway musicals, to constantly be like, I'm living my dream, this is great, this is amazing, and no matter what the working conditions or the pay or how much of my life and my own humanity I have to sacrifice in order to do this job, and how much of my own personal creative ambition I have to put on hold, it's worth it because it's a Broadway musical, and because it's so many people's dream, people think that whatever the situation is, that actors ought to be grateful. And I do think that this is a bizarre perspective. I spoke about this recently when talking about Lea Michele in Funny Girl. I think people hold acting as a profession and as a job and as a career to a different standard than we hold people in other professions. For someone to give an interview and say they're not being completely fulfilled in their job, they appreciate the salary, they like the social aspect of going to work, but they feel like they are going to work, I feel like that's a great many people. I don't think you would criticize, a teacher for saying the same thing. I don't think you'd criticize someone working at Tesco for saying the same thing. Like, what do you mean you are not being completely creatively fulfilled by the supermarket checkout job that you're working? How dare you? You are living someone's dream. Like, almost every job, there is somebody coveting that job in the world because we're living in very trying and difficult times, and a lot of people are wanting job opportunities who, for various reasons, can't access them. So I don't think this is unique to Broadway stardom, or, to put it more simply, being an actor working on a Broadway show, because realistically, it is a job and we should stop seeing it as this God-given vocation. It does nobody any favours to glorify and sugarcoat this process of starring in a Broadway musical. There's some more really interesting stuff in this article where Sara talks about their own Filipino heritage and how that intersects with playing a pro-slavery character. I would encourage you to go and read it, but that is not what has prompted a lot of the controversy. So we're going to move on to some more of the controversial answers. When asked, when you describe 1776, it sounds like it's a compromise that you're willing to make to get where you need to be, Sara replies, definitely. So slightly later on, they're talking about specific moments in the show, and the interviewer asks, there's another moment when the cast looks out at the audience as Franklin says, what will posterity think we were, demigods? We're men, no more no less, trying to get a nation started against greater odds than a more generous god would have allowed. Sara replies, I think that choice is actually really bad. It feels cringy. On the inside, I'm cringing at that. I'm cringing at the effing projected egg song, and I cringe a little at the end when we hold out those coats. I'm like, it's okay, I wouldn't have wanted it this way, but I am doing my job. The turnout is a bad choice because in that moment, with what Franklin is saying and us turning out to the audience, it doesn't achieve what the directors wanted it to. It's the most humanizing text in this play, and we're standing there looking at the audience. But the reason we were directed to look at the audience was to remind the audience that we weren't considered when this compromise was made. Does that read? No, it doesn't. It drives me crazy. I think you've already achieved that goal, directors, by casting us in this show. People are going to interpret the text first and foremost. And I do have mixed feelings about this, because I think if you're going to criticise other people's creative input into a show that you are working on, at the very least, in fairness, they have talked articulately about the intentions of that moment and the specificities of why they are not being achieved. That's something that I would talk about a lot as a critic. That's something that a lot of the reviewers would have talked about. So it comes down to a question of, do we think it's appropriate to criticise other people's work in a creative project that you are involved with, and to do so publicly? And I think it's a difficult one, because Sara definitely seems to agree with what the intention of that moment was, but is also very frank and honest about saying that it doesn't read the way that it was intended. And it does get a little bit worse, because next Sara is asked, how do you see queerness interacting with that show? And answers, I'll be honest and say that our directors never thought about that. When we were all in the room together, there wasn't any conversation about how we marry our queer identities with these characters, which is disappointing. It was clear that they were prioritising the social identifier of race as a driving creative choice more than anything else. Gender identity, sexual identity, those we weren't talking about. There's a lot of further discussion about whether or not the cast was specifically directed to play men. Sara says there are energies that we've all agreed are masculine, but we can also recognise that not all men act like that and find our own way into those characters. But those weren't discussions that took place in rehearsal, unfortunately. Gosh, then it gets very specific, talking about the American Repertory Theatre, which is a regional American theatre where this revival of 1776 first premiered, where Waitress also premiered originally. And we're talking about the American Repertory Theatre's recent problematic history with how they approach representation for non-binary people. So this is another of Diane Paulus's recent productions, Jagged Little Pill. Now, Jagged Little Pill's controversy when it comes to casting trans actors in trans roles, and then the subsequent attempted erasure of its non-binary character, for which the cisgender performer playing that character won a Tony Award, has been very well documented. Other people have made videos about this. I haven't spoken about this, but you can absolutely find out about what happened there. That is what this is in reference to. When asked what did the American Repertory Theatre learn or not learn from past experiences, Sara replied they learned that they messed up. A blind spot was revealed to them. In terms of fixing that blind spot, they did a very accessible step for an institution. You educate yourselves, you hire consultants, you have a gender explosion workshop with your current production. But often that first step of education ends when the workshop is done, which I think is unfortunate. When asked what should be done, Sara replies there has to be accountability first and foremost. Accountability for the harm that was done, for the mistake that was made, directly to the people that need it. There needs to be transparency that upholds accountability, but people have to realise just because you're transparent, it doesn't mean people are going to forgive you. They need to practice it as a cultural principle. Then there's investigation and restructuring. The third step is institutional and community collaboration. Institutions are always making these 5-year effing plans and being like, we're going to make it with a consultant and we'll share it later. Then they share it with the community after 2 years, and now the community doesn't care about the institution anymore. When asked specifically what is the value of an establishment theatre like the American Repertory Theatre, Sarah replies, "I don't know what the value of an establishment theatre is. I want to believe that it has value, but I will tell you I'm not very interested in running an establishment theatre because I would constantly be asking myself that question." Now, all of what we've just heard is controversial and surprising, but it's also the kind of criticism of theatre and commercial theatre as an establishment and as this structured and built up and historic thing that we talked about a lot during the pandemic. People talked a lot about these old institutions and building back better and coming back in a way that was more inclusive and more diverse. And I'm not about to pretend that these weren't conversations that a lot of people were having very openly and very widely and that were being supported by people at the time. And a lot of people committed to doing a lot of listening and a lot of involving and inclusion. And a lot of those same people, now that financial opportunities have returned to them in the wake of the pandemic, seem to be ignoring the fact that certain conversations and certain changes were promised during that time. I think for Sarah saying these things, they are surprised by the reaction that is happening, because it's very much like, we were all talking about this. Do you not remember that we all said that institutional changes need to be made? Here is the time for making those changes. Why am I the only one still pushing this agenda? And when that agenda is inclusivity and uplifting artists and a diverse group of artists, then it's not something that I'm about to condemn. Here is where it gets even more honest and frank about the realities of working in a Broadway musical. When asked, what do you hope to get out of being in 1776 on Broadway, Sarah answers, a Tony nomination, good reviews, and a smart, personable, hard-working agency that's ready to rep me. Good for you. Audition your agents. Also, I guess more Instagram followers and more community here in New York. I don't just want a career. I could make a career just being in commercial Broadway musicals. And for the most part, I think that that's incredibly realistic, and I think that's the kind of thing that a lot of people want out of that kind of a role in Broadway musicals. If you're in that kind of a leading or a supporting track where people are talking about you, where you're getting to do these interviews because you're the breakout star of a show, you are going to be thinking about a Tony nomination. You are going to be thinking about recognition in reviews. I've done enough Amdram to know that people want to be recognized in reviews. I don't think it makes you arrogant for acknowledging these things. Also, especially if you don't currently have representation, that's going to be a big factor. If you're starring in a Broadway musical in a great supporting role, you're going to be wanting representation. And good for them for not just settling for the representation offers they've already had, to want to be represented as a multi-hyphenate performer. If that's the work that they want to do, then that's the kind of agent that they need, is someone who understands them as an artist. The Instagram followers thing, I think, reads a little bit more arrogantly, but if we're being honest, I think a lot of people probably want that kind of a platform, especially when you want to do work that includes a community and speaks to a community, and you want a platform with which to do that. And you don't want to have to be tethered to a Broadway show. If you want to be able to say important things and spread awareness of different ideas, then you need your own platform in order to be able to do that without having to rely on capitalism and commercial shows on Broadway. This is where I'm really interested in the responses, because the interviewer goes on to ask, don't you have the instinct to make more compromises to see if you can get a bigger audiences? Again, very honest and very realistic questioning here. Sarah answers, I'll be honest with you, if the producers of Six came to me and said, we want you to be a replacement, I'd be like, which one? And if it was anyone other than Anne Boleyn, anyone other than the Asian girl in the show, or even if it was Anne Boleyn, I'd say, what are you paying? At the end of the day, if I'm compromising my desire to do my own work, but the resources are there, it really just comes down to labour. If I'm compromising, I'd better be getting paid a lot more money, honey. I have to ask, do I want to give 100% of myself to this? And for Six, no, they're going to get 75%, but that 75% will be great, which is bold and ballsy, but I kind of got to respect it. And it raises a very interesting point about colourblind casting that seems to be specific. I've said this before with shows that come over to the UK, and we have this one role in the show that is considered the diverse role or the non-white role that is always cast a certain way. And Six, to their credit, have been great at varying their casting. We've seen some really great diversity within Six. At the same time, there is also this slightly recurring tendency to have Asian performers in the show specifically go into the role of Anne Boleyn. And while it may just be a coincidence that on the few occasions this has happened, it has been the correct role for that performer, and this is not to say there haven't been Asian performers in other roles in Six, there have, but we do have still a little bit of a lingering template of specific diverse casting within a show like Six, and that's something I really wish that we could just completely obliterate and have race not even be any kind of a factor, just ensure that it is diverse, that we have a broad range of different ethnicities and races represented in the cast, and that they don't have to be allocated to specific roles, because as far as I can tell, there's no reason. There's no reason. Now this 75% comment, this is what has gotten picked up a lot on social media. Sarah elaborates on that and says, giving 100% of myself to everything all the time is a recipe for disaster. How am I going to have time for myself, for my partner, or for my family? I want to choose when I do that. And we end the interview with this. What percentage are you giving 1776? Sarah answers, I'm giving 75%. When I do Molasses to Rum, the song in the second act, I'm giving 90%. And I cannot wholeheartedly tell you that a lot of performers don't also do this. I have seen performers and I've known performers who will dial back their energy levels when it's not their big solo. If they have a particularly great moment in the show, then they will up their energy level and they will up their involvement in the show. But I cannot tell you every single performer is in it 100% every single night, every single show. There is a reason for long-running shows that I will try and go and see specific performances, because if you see a cast that have been doing something for years and you catch them on a midweek matinee, I can't guarantee to you some of them aren't going to be phoning it in. I've been to Wicked and heard lackluster tenor harmonies. I'm not going to shout out any specific cast, but I've heard it and it's happened. So for us to now be getting outraged at this performer who's being very honest and realistic about saying they give 75%, I think is a bit naive of the Broadway community. Now the story goes on social media because Sarah has had a lot of backlash specifically for that 75% comment. People are outraged because they say when people are paying 100% of ticket prices, why are you giving 75% of a performance? That's unfair and it's callous and it's arrogant. People are calling this classic millennial behaviour, and I don't know if that's true. Also, I don't think that entire audience is paying 100% of their ticket price. We shouldn't start quibbling about percentages because you're going to open a whole can of financial worms. Second of all, it's not really clear what Sarah means by this. Are we talking about 75% of what they could reasonably give within the context of the show, or is that 75% because a certain amount is reserved for just the rest of their life? Now, they have elaborated on this in a tweet. They said 75% equals performing in 1776, 10% is sleeping, 5% is eating, 5% is pooping, 5% is self-care, aka not devoting my entire life to being a Broadway star, which is evidently a little bit satirical, but at the very least the math does check out. So can confirm to you as a GCSE maths teacher that does add up to 100%, and sleeping would be way more than 10. But I do think that people are human beings first, and if the performance is getting raves and is getting these great notices and speaking for itself, then you can't go back and say, but you were giving 75%, you owe us 100%. If you already loved that 75% and you didn't know that that was a 75% performance, clearly that sacrifice that Sarah is making is a calculated one that has paid off. You know, they were cast in the role for a reason. Evidently, it's going well. Where the whole thing gets a little bit more messy is one of the co-directors has responded to this on their personal Facebook page. So this is Jeffrey Page, who wrote, "Dear nameless person, I know that you feel good about that thing you said. I didn't feel good about it. I know you feel like it is now your time in the sun. You ain't put in the time and you ain't done the work. You are ungrateful and unwise. You claim that you want to dismantle white supremacist ideology. I think that you are the very example of the thing that you claim to be most interested in dismantling." Now, for a black man to accuse an Asian performer of being representative of white supremacist ideology feels like a lot, and it feels like a misguided attack, and it feels like a retaliation out of personal upset and insult more so than anything else. You are fake woke, rotten to the core, and stuck in the matrix. I hope that you get that increased Instagram following that you so desperately thirst. I mean, to pick up on just the one thing from that article, when a great many articulate and important things were said, again, it feels like reacting out of passion and upset, But this is definitely a controversial thing for Sara to have done. You know, it's one thing to give this kind of an interview when you have finished performing in the show, when the show has closed, and to do it retrospectively, to say, I didn't agree with that choice, when I did that every night I wasn't sure about it, but to do it when the show is still just opening, when momentum is building, and this is now all anyone can say about this show, it is obviously going to impair your relationship with the creative team. Now, granted, once the show is open, that relationship is not as prominent because the show has already been directed. Mostly you then work with a resident director, but I feel like it also puts the rest of the cast in a difficult position. Likely they are going to be asked, if not by reporters, then by friends and family, how they feel about this, whether they agree about some of the oversights in the show's direction, in its creative devising. And one way or another, I feel like this is definitely going to have created a tense workplace environment, which, you know, many of us in our real lives can relate to. As a British person, the correct thing I'm supposed to say is that you just suck all of this up and you behave modestly and you don't celebrate and uplift yourself and you just do what you're told and you do your job because you're grateful to have your job and you shouldn't complain about anything. But I don't think that that is the best thing you can do for yourself. And at the end of the day, how much do we think Sara owes to their creatives and their cast of this show, and how much do we think we owe to ourselves as artists and performers and individuals in terms of ranking respect and who you owe respect to? Where do we rank self-respect among that? I'm so intrigued to hear people's thoughts on this. Like I said, there have been racially motivated responses to this. There has been this generational debate about whether this is a very millennial approach to something, to openly declare that you are dedicating less of yourself and less of your work ethic to a particular job. Do we think every Broadway performer needs to give 100% all of the time, or when 75% is already great? Is that enough? What are your thoughts on this particular growing controversy? It will be very interesting following this to see what happens with Sara's career, to see whether a Tony nomination does actually happen. We're still very early in the Broadway season to know what other kind of roles would be in contention for nomination in the same category. But to my knowledge, 1776 has not opened with glowing reviews, and it does seem very much like this is the thing people are now talking about with it the most, which has put 1776 back into the focus of conversation one way or another, but not necessarily for all of the right reasons. Honestly, I think this whole thing could have been articulated a little bit better. I think PR probably ought to have been involved. I say that as someone who is in a relationship with a PR representative, and I know all of the work that they do, and managing this kind of a situation is completely within their remit, and this could have been put out in a better way so as to not create this division between the cast and the creative team, so we're not seeing all of this being messily played out on social media. I think a lot of the thoughts are very legitimate, and some of them are expressed brilliantly and honestly and brutally, and some of them are expressed in a way that is a little bit inarticulate. And perhaps completely honest and completely what Sara meant to say, but there are probably gentler ways of cushioning it, or just a better time to say these kinds of things. I think you can still be honest to yourself and you can still be true to your convictions while retaining these kind of opinions until slightly later in the show's run, or until after you have left the show. Is that unfair of me to say? What do you think in the comments? I'm still really ruminating on this, and I do celebrate Sara for saying a lot of this stuff, and I think there are a lot of structures and a lot of things that need to be dismantled within Broadway's more archaic practices. And I think a lot of that is very true for West End theatre as well. I'm not going to let the UK get off of this scot-free. And I am once again reminded that the way that people treat acting as this profession and this vocation doesn't do actors as individuals any kind of favours, to glorify and deify them with these God-given gifts and opportunities when they are just actors doing a job who lead ordinary lives outside of that. So many different problems arise from the way that we look at acting as this different and better kind of job. You know, when people are following actors home from a stage door, when people are getting mad that they won't stop and sign things, they assume it comes from a place of arrogance and not from a place of humanity. I think everyone, and this includes actors, is entitled to as much personal freedom as they want, and that is when they are leaving their workplace, that is when they are performing in a show. Oh my god, hey, it's me from the future, and yet also the past. As I'm editing this video, there are a couple of very brief little additions that I want to make. One thing is, having reread the interview several times because I am fascinated and obsessed by this, there's a very interesting section about harm done to the cast with the kind of racial organisation of one of the numbers, Molasses to Rum, in which the black members of the cast were positioned as slaves at an auction, and the non-black people of colour within the cast were positioned as playing the white characters in that scene. There are other moments throughout the show where the casting is completely diverse and you have black performers playing white characters and everyone is generally playing white men because it's the Declaration of Independence, it's the Founding Fathers. But it's very interesting, and Sarah had some very interesting things to say about non-white performers of colour being asked to play white people during a slave auction scene, and that kind of being this thoughtless creative transaction. That was really interesting to me. Also, this whole thing, in hindsight, reminds me a lot of the interview Karen Olivo gave after leaving Moulin Rouge abruptly, and I think the biggest difference is that Karen had obviously already left the show rather than still being in the show, but did speak very candidly about a lot of things that don't get talked about on Broadway. Karen spoke about the costuming in Moulin Rouge causing them lasting health issues, for example. And so I do still think it's important that this gets talked about. I do wonder if there's a certain lack of grace or forethought in talking about it so openly while the show is still open. Sara has acknowledged this to a certain extent on their Twitter feed. You can go and read all of their tweets in response to this because there are so many, but those were just some extra thoughts that I had. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed. We talked about a lot of things. This may be a conversation and a story that evolves, in which case I may make another video about this. And there's another Broadway situation that is unfolding at the same time to do with Hadestown. I am planning to talk about that as well, so stay tuned, because both of them have similar parallel conversations that are going on, and both of them have unfortunate responses motivated by racism, if we're being completely honest. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any more content that I make about Broadway controversy. Also, if you really enjoyed, you can use the super thanks button down below to give me a tip. That very much helps me as a Stager content creator, or you can go to patreon.com/MickeyJoeTheatre, where you can also gain access to some exclusive photo and video content. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day.
For 10 more seconds, I'm Mickey Joe Theatre. Oh my god, hey, thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!